Okay. So, today we're going to be talking about, we're going to be looking at like Genghis Khan and the Mongolian horde. But there's two aspects and questions I kind of like to answer as we're going through it. And one is, how did the Mongolians help shape societal and institutions that for us are would be or considered normal nowadays? And the other one is, how has the nature of the Mongolian conquest helped shape empire buildings in some of the nations it occupied? And both of these questions I'd like to answer because there's connections that we tend to forget to overlook in the West, and maybe even that was just been forgotten till history till very recently as well. And the idea of, when we think of Mongolians, we think of angry, conquering, a very bloody and dark time in history. And as much as it was, there was also a lot of interesting things that come out of it that I think even today, 800 years later, still are considered cornerstones to some degree in developed societies, or what we call like developed nations. So in terms of institutions, we're speaking of things like religious freedom, um, expansionist trade routes, and connecting people, which is not really what people would think of when they think of the Mongolians. But there is there's definitely some stuff we'd like to kind of go into there with that. So in that perspective, today we're going to be looking at the catalyst that is Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde. He's Braden, I'm Jordan, and this is the catalyst. So I'm going to kind of start with how did just looking at how certain things that the Mongolians implemented, brought to the nations they conquered, kind of carried on even in in today's society. So we have to think that what time period we're talking about first and foremost, which 1206 to 1341 is considered the lifespan of the Mongolian Empire. So 1206 is when Genghis Khan would have started his conquests in China and then westward through the Eurasian steppe towards places like we know today is somewhere in like the Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and then into the Middle East and into Eastern Europe as well eventually. And I'm just going to kind of, there's a lot of things going on in the 12th century, as we know. In the Middle East, there was the Crusades between Islamic and Christian warlords and kingdoms. China was also, at the start of Genghis Khan's conquest, a unified nation under the Han Dynasty. You know what? Hold on a sec. I lost my train of thought.
No worries. Like, where do you want to start from?
Back where I was talking about like how they brought people together.
Okay. Hopefully there's a easy point for me to edit
Transition
from.
that.
Yeah. I'll have to figure that out.
Okay. So usually when we think of Mongolians and people think of Mongolians, technically the cliche is that it was a time of violence, death, and conquest, which, as much as it was, very much so that there was also things that the Mongolians implemented in the nations that they conquered that we would carry on, maybe knowingly or unknowingly, in our institutions hundreds of years later. And one of the big ones that I think most people wouldn't typically think of to be considered their card is religious freedom. And there's reasons to that, because as we know, the Mongolian Empire at the time of Genghis Khan's death was actually twice the size of the Roman Empire at its height. So it encompassed a lot of land, a lot of different people, and a lot of different religions. And for them to hold that empire together, they had to be a little more, I wouldn't say accepting, but maybe a little more in the sense of we were as much conquering you as we are rebuilding your nation with you under the Mongolian
Yeah, I think
rule, right?
if I can interject even,
Yeah.
and now I don't know this for absolute certainty or anything like that, but I feel like the philosophy behind the Mongol Empire was that, as funny as it sounds, they didn't care what the like local populations did. It wasn't about spreading Mongol culture. It was more about this idea of conquering the like known
Correct.
world, so to speak, right? And
And
that,
building up from there. Correct.
yeah, and really it was kind of that that aspect of everything is tributary to the Mongol Empire, like to the Mongol people. But
Yes, you
it,
practice as you see fit, but you pay your tribute to the state.
yeah, like different than I, because you had mentioned the Romans earlier, right? I feel like the
Yes.
Romans really felt like their culture was above all else, right? But the Mongols were
Yes.
like, I could kind of care less what you do as long as you fall in
Yes, like
line.
that's a very good point because the Romans in a lot of places they wouldn't suppress the culture, but it wasn't always like Christians weren't allowed to openly practice the religion for the first few centuries
Yeah,
in Rome.
definitely. Yeah.
And it's interesting to think that at the time the Mongolians were doing this, like we were mentioning, there was crusades taking place in the Middle East between the Islamic caliphates and some of the Christian nations of Southern Europe. And to think that Genghis Khan, within his own inner circle, kept as advisors men that were Buddhists, men that were Muslims, men that were Christian,
Hmm.
and it's very interesting because the area there was so much. I think, and that's the thing. Like, if you look at a map of what the Mongolian Empire was, and you think about today how many nations are included in that area,
Yeah.
and even just to keep it under the like one, I wouldn't say like one state, but in terms of under the rule of one oligarchy, in a sense, maybe is a loose term because it was mostly the family, and not having it in a sense where you had people oppressed. It's like you were saying, where they wanted to conquer and move on. So they were also known as well, right? They they would leave civilian populations intact depending on the situation. They weren't always into the business of wiping everybody out, but there is an interesting point in the fact that under the Mongolians, printed paper also became a far more common issued thing through states. Before the Mongolians, most like state documents or like royal documents, like the king or the royal family,
Okay.
would actually print on vellum in places like Europe. And it was
I
actually the
don't even know what that is.
Mongolians.
Valium?
Yeah, I remember researching this, and it was I did not know that most state documents until the Mongolians came around, because it's ironic that during their conquest kind of overlapped with the introduction towards the end of the Mongolian Empire with the introduction of the printing press.
And is that because paper was cheaper and then you, if you run the risk of it getting destroyed, or what's the reason for
That's
that, or do you
actually
know?
that's an interesting point, actually. So the idea of paper making existed in China for quite some time. I think like almost like back to the early like 500 BC, like AD kind of time.
Okay.
And certain Arab nations had captured and fought the Chinese several hundred years before the Mongolians, and had their own kind of rudimentary that they learned for themselves from fighting the
Paper
Chinese.
making.
Yes.
Okay.
And as the Mongolians came through the Middle East, Central Asia, and then eventually Eastern Europe, especially, they started imposing this idea of using a paper currency. And I was there's an interesting book. I'm just trying to remember the name of it here. I didn't want to do it any injustice. It'll come back to me. They were talking the fact that the author was basically saying that
Excuse me.
for them, because their trade system was so large, it was so intricate, that paper notes became the easiest way for exchanging trading and information, all that kind of stuff. But
Okay.
because of the vast amount of territories, there were so many different nations. Yet, like, I don't know if the currency in Europe at the time was denarii, whatever it was, right? But everyone had a slightly different currency, and the Mongolians
Hmm.
ended up encompassing so many of those separate currencies that they kind of had to issue a sort of universal piece of paper,
Hmm.
which also, which kind of weird because it actually worked like the first passport as well. So if you were a trader from, just say like Italy, and you're traveling through what would be the Silk Road, they the Mongolians, once you enter their territory, issue this paper, this little stamped piece of paper that you can carry around so that you're not taxed as a
Okay. Yep.
foreigner in their
Yep.
land there to trade. You are not
Yep.
persecuted under their laws or any of that kind of stuff. So it's an
Because
interesting.
you were
It's
like authorized to be there, type of
correct.
thing.
Yes, and the
Yeah.
Mongolians, it's
Okay.
were actually just as interested in people's stuff as they were conquering it. They were very fascinated in trading, and it was really the Mongolians that solidified what we know as the Silk Road,
Yeah.
because it had existed loosely for centuries, like since the early time of the Romans. But until the Mongolians really came through, it was never really a connected trade route. And they not only connected it by land, but they connected it by sea from China to the Persian Gulf, and then from the Persian Gulf into the Black Sea.
Okay.
And so it's really the Mongolians brought paper to, I would at least say, to Europe in the way that we're used to seeing it now. Because it's ironic that the timing of the printing press was invented in Germany around the same time the Mongolians were kind of diminishing as an influential power, but yet still had, and a lot of those caliphates too, especially in Eastern Europe. There was one around the Black Sea that existed into the 16th century. So they still had like a level of influence on trade and all this kind of
Hmm.
stuff. But there was many reasons that even today we would consider wasn't very common for a conquering empire of its time. Like the idea of using the local population as the civil administrators. Like when we think of the French Empire, the French would go in to a place in like, I'm trying to think, like Algeria, and local Algerians during the colonial time were not allowed to participate in government. Whereas the way the Mongolians were able to hold such a large empire together, even for the short time that they did, which 150 years is still quite impressive for the size of the thing,
Hmm.
was that they would go into a place like in Tibet, right, and take local figures who were well respected amongst the population
Yeah.
and use them as their state administrators and go, you pay your tribute, we put you in a nice house, and you go about your business as usual and make sure that our tribute gets paid. And it's the idea that you would think nowadays that we want visible, like we want people that seem marginalized in society to be able to participate equally, right?
Hmm.
And it's kind of crazy to think that the Mongolians were doing that in the 13th century
Yeah. That the
in
like
a loose
dominant.
fashion, right?
Yep.
Yeah, because even in places like Kiev, or in like the lands of the Rus at the time,
Yep. Yep.
it's very interesting. I don't want to go too much into that yet because I'm going to talk about that in a little bit into the next question, anyways. But I'll bring that back up in a bit. And just to like on the note of what they did for like how we would see some of our institutions as they are today, in the sense where they're fair, free, and open to everybody. You can kind of see that it's great. I don't think it's even me researching this. I was like, really, the Mongolians were doing this in
Yeah.
1250? I mean, the Inquisition happened 300 years later.
Yeah.
So it's crazy to think, right? And that you have this idea of, okay, it's a giant conquering empire, but they're taking an approach to it that it's ruled by the people they conquer.
Yeah, they were very, I feel like, self-aware in terms of their limitations, I guess.
Yes,
Right?
yeah.
Being a nomadic people, right? Like at their heart, the Mongols have always been that.
Yes, they're very
And then when you're going to go conquer all these areas, if you want them to fall in line, they fall in line through obviously an element of fear,
fear
right?
to some
Because you've
degree.
been
Yeah,
conquered.
yeah.
And if I come back, like if there's an issue, like I'm going to really
We're gonna
conquer.
do the same thing again.
Yeah. Um, but then recognizing that, like, no, if I want the daily life and the administration of things to run smoothly, I might as well just allow the people that were kind of already doing that.
Yes,
Um, because I also you had said some stuff earlier and it made me think of I feel like the Mongols, and you could maybe argue the Huns were also like this, different times of course, but um the Mongol Empire um is like the improvement on like Viking. Like that idea of like raiding parties, and where it's like,
correct.
I'm going to come
Yes,
in, I'm going to do destruction, I'm going to take a bunch of stuff, but I'm not
yeah,
going to just completely destroy things, because they recognize like that's their kind of their meal ticket. Like that's how you get your sources of income, because if I wipe out a place, well then I get nothing back after that
back
point,
after
right?
it. Correct.
Like it,
Yes,
and recognizing that, yeah, sure, we're going to settle in some pockets here and there. Obviously, the Vikings were a little bit more motivated by finding some like farmland and stuff like that. But
correct. Yeah, because there's a little bit. The climate gets a little bit worse in the winter.
yeah, so there's some different elements that are
Actually, the
kind of tied
Mongolians
in.
too. Yeah, they
Yeah,
don't have the nicest
right.
climate. That's why they
The
left.
steppes are not necessarily known
The
for their
nicest place.
farming
Yeah,
necessarily, right? But lots of wildlife and everything else, so you can make it
yeah.
work. But yeah, it's um interesting parallels in that sense of different than kind of your typical empires, whether it be Rome or
At least, yeah, how we
China,
would assume
India, or
when it pops into your head, right? Like the French Empire, or yeah,
yeah, right? Like where it's like we're just going to expand and conquer, and
yeah,
like the British going to India and like taking over, and like we're going to
yeah.
fully come
And like
here.
you can pick parts throughout any point of history. Even you could say that the Persian Empire for its time
Yeah.
during the Greek times was slightly a little bit more clumsy, but they were still brutal, and
Yeah.
and they would
Yeah.
use the people they conquered as their auxiliary troops so that they could save their guys
Yeah.
for last. Yeah,
Yeah,
so,
it was like wherever possible they would still have a Persian in charge, type
correct.
of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Whereas the Mongolians kind of showed up,
Yeah.
consolidated, and then moved on. And that
Yeah.
system, and I brought it up a little earlier, was very effective because there was places that I'm trying to, I always get tongue twisted on this, Mongolian caliphates. So some of the ones
Yep.
after the empire broke up, they took on the culture and religion of the people in that area.
Mhm.
So the ruling Khans became, some of them in certain areas converted to Islam.
Yeah. Okay.
Some in other areas became Orthodox Christians, and some of them existed in
Mm.
the Caucasian steppes, like we were
Yeah,
saying,
yeah.
like into the 17th century almost, which is pretty impressive considering they didn't. It's not like they did this with manpower.
Yeah. And because I think it is so interesting. We always, especially nowadays, right? We're so uh possessive over our own culture, right?
Yes,
Like and all that. But the Mongols were not threatened by anything.
no,
Like
they
and that
absorbed. Yeah,
goes militarily and culturally,
culturally.
right?
Yeah,
They absorbed everything. They took what they wanted. They weren't worried about being eradicated. Maybe sometimes to their detriment. I know that historically some of the Mongols didn't love how Chinese eventually the Mongol Empire became, because when it changed to be seated
yes,
in in China, but I'm not sure if you're going to talk about that, and I apologize if I've stolen
No,
your
no,
thunder
no,
or something.
no, 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 no. It's a good
But
point, actually.
but yeah, they really like that. I feel like that's almost like a case in point. The seat of the Mongol Empire did not stay in Mongolia, right?
Correct.
Like it would be
Yes,
like Rome
it was
deciding
fluid.
early
Yes,
on that it was going to go to uh, By, Byzantium, like
or Spain. Yeah,
right, like yeah, or
yeah,
Spain, just like
yeah.
right from the beginning, be like
We're
whatever, it
moving the
doesn't
capital
matter.
to
Yeah,
Londinium. Yeah.
yeah, right, yeah, exactly.
Let's go see
Um,
what those guys are up to. For
yeah, so it is a really
yeah, and it's
a
just like
nuanced way of conquering the world, as much as that sounds
it is.
kind of
It
silly.
doesn't. Yeah,
Yeah.
no. But it's a very interesting because it's something today that we take for granted in regular life, where we just go about and
Hmm.
you're expected to have this as basic human rights, and that it's just the irony that the Mongolians may have been the catalyst for a lot of
Hmm. The most
institutional
progressive.
acceptance. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
By
The
having,
ones
yeah,
who pillaged the world were also the most progressive in their politics and
yeah, they started something that,
governing.
and it was so long ago, it's easy to forget that we can draw the breadcrumbs all the way back there, right?
Hmm.
And especially like I was saying, with such with the reputation that they've earned themselves throughout history,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That because we all know the other reason that they were very successful is that the Mongolians were not afraid to mix with local populations as well.
yes.
And in other cases, like it took the Saxons centuries to mix in England because for the longest time they refused to.
Yeah,
And then eventually time just wears everybody down. But the Mongolians were not so much hesitant. And I think
yeah,
most people know the stat that I think there's like 30 million people on Earth today that can directly trace their genetic lineage to Genghis Khan.
yeah, which is one person.
Yes, one dude. And we live
Yeah,
in a country with almost that many people. And it's a
yeah,
G7 country.
yeah,
So we are in one of the eighth largest economy on the planet with just a few million more people than the total amount of descendants of Genghis Khan.
yeah,
Which is it's yeah.
yeah. It's a crazy statistic in that sense, right? When you put it
Hey,
into
but I guess
a bit of perspective.
love is love, right?
I I don't know if it was always love, but
Well, I guess
yeah,
they
it
didn't
was
have gloves
something.
back then. Yes.
Yeah. When you got a lot of power, I guess you can do what you want. So yeah, it's not to say
Yeah.
that these are the saviors of mankind by any stretch.
Oh, no, no. But it is
But
interesting to see how they really did shape a lot of what we would say is more enlightened thought in terms of the
yeah.
way they would administer an empire.
Yeah, and I think the interest, or probably the way that I see things as one of the more interesting aspects, is they did it without thinking about it. Like, I don't think that that was their intention. I think it was just like a very realist perspective in the sense
Yes.
of recognizing your limitations, recognizing how do we oversee this large of an empire, this large of a diversity of
Territory. Yeah.
cultures,
Yeah.
like everything,
Peoples.
and recognizing who we are as Mongols, um, from a historical standpoint. Like the Mongols had multiple different khans, like essentially like leaders
Yes.
of villages and stuff like that.
Yep.
And so it wasn't until like eventually where they
And
kind of all get united under one.
one
Um,
correct. And it
yeah,
wasn't the first time them as a people had come in a conquest capacity this way. They had
no,
1,000 years before under the name
yeah,
of the Huns,
yeah,
and they terrorized the Roman Empire for centuries.
yeah, yeah, and just recognizing, because like even in like, because you mentioned it, even in the Huns, like with Attila, it wasn't the political structure, like the governing structures that exist within um, the Mongol Empire, as well
Yeah,
as
in
the
its
Huns.
territories. Yeah.
Yeah, was not necessarily designed to be like like I know we've brought it up a few times, but you look at Rome, and
Yeah.
obviously before the Roman Empire, it was the Roman Republic. Well, that administration, the Roman Republic, even though it does shift to become the empire and it does become a situation where you do have like the first among many, like the
Many,
idea
yeah,
that there is truly one Caesar, there is one person that is at the head of the empire.
yeah, the
The
chief among
essence of the
equals, yeah,
republic, that administration, that system, the Senate, right, is something that carries forward all the way through the empire, and you're
yeah.
able to have this kind of like governing ship and all that stuff like that is already ingrained
In
before the
there,
Roman Empire
that's
even
true.
exists.
Yeah,
Like under the Roman Republic, that is a thing, right?
yeah, because the
But it's
Senate
not
exists
really the
well into
case
the
for
empire.
the
Yeah,
Mongols, right? they
yes,
they have a little more isolated. It's like you said, it's a little more family oriented.
it's a
um
little more play as you go kind of thing.
Yeah, it's more like it would be typically what I think you would see in a lot of just tribes where you have like
Correct.
the equivalent of a group of elders type of situation, and they kind of run things. Well, it might be one person that is running them, but it's that same concept of there isn't that same administrative aspect,
From
which
the top down,
you
yeah.
100% require if you're going to run an empire, right?
Especially one of that size. Yeah.
Yeah, right. You're
Yeah, the Romans
talking
are
about a nomadic people that are conquering established areas, right? Like because
yeah.
by this time period, a lot of the areas that they cover or like conquer
Oh, it's
are full
way
out like civilizations and countries
on their
and
own.
states and
Yeah. And
yeah.
even today, like if you look, like it must have encompassed well over 75 modern states nowadays,
Hmm.
or at least close to it. Because you think of all the little countries in Central Asia there that are packed in there. They also tried to invade Japan twice. They were in
Yep.
India. They went
Yeah.
around Afghanistan. They took Persia. They did. They did burn some of the Arab libraries in the Middle East.
Yeah.
The fighting there got kind of extreme.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
at the time the caliphates were quite powerful, right? So like it was not
Yeah. And
not a
that's I think also such an interesting thing, right? It's this is not like they didn't just come in and take down weak like fleeting empires
or
around them.
warlords or just
Like
little or
yeah.
centralized tribes to this one area. No, it's you're right.
Yeah.
And actually that just opened up what I kind of want to talk about a little bit perfectly
Go
was
for
that
it.
I posed the question as like how is the nature of the Mongol conquest shaped empire building? But I also kind of wanted to look in sorry, just one sec. Allergies today. Also, I was in a house with 4 cats the other day, so
No worries. I'll bleep out the for all of our viewers. You won't have to hear it.
thank you. Yeah,
Yeah.
but also too, kind of the imprint that the Mongolian conquest left psychologically on some peoples.
Yeah.
And there's one I would really like to specifically look at in that aspect, and that is the
Okay.
Eastern Slavic people of the Rus.
Okay. Yeah, you were
And
mentioning something about that earlier.
yeah, so we if you go back to like the 6th century, what would today be like the ancestors of like the early Russian and Eastern Slavic people. So everybody east of the what's that mountain range in Central West or Eastern Europe?
Caucasus
Yeah, or yeah,
or
something. Sorry, not Caucasus. The other one, the
no?
one in
What's the
Romania.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
in Romania, so Parthians or something like that. But everybody, all the Slavs east of there, all
Okay.
were technically one group of people at one point under the Kiev of the Rus.
Yep.
So the capital of the Rus people at one point in history was Kiev.
Yep.
And when the Mongolians came through, it was the middle of the 12th century. So actually, it was Genghis Khan's son, which I am horrible at trying to pronounce his name, Ubugudi Khan. But
I'd have to
he
look it up. I
he
only
was the
know
one that
Kublai,
Kublai, yes, who's
which
his
which is the
grandson.
grandson. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And he consolidated the conquest of the people of the Rus, and it was so thorough and it was so traumatic that they actually never recovered as the way they were before. So the capital being in Kiev was no more
Hmm.
after that, and it were like the Rus people was a confederation before the Mongolians showed up. of like a bunch of different city states that were all kind of the same loose people, spoke the same
Okay. Yeah.
language.
Yep.
After the Mongolians, because they put up such a, it was very like the resistance with them. The Mongolians were very thorough in dismantling. Only two cities really were left intact after the Mongolians came through. But the interesting thing is, under the Mongolians, a new city started to rise in power, and it was the Grand Duchy of Moscow.
Mm.
By the time that Kublai Khan passed away and some of the caliphates started to disintegrate, and the Mongolian Empire kind of started going the way Alexander's empire did,
Hmm.
the Duchy of Moscow became the most powerful city state in the region.
Okay.
And the families ended up splitting the rule between there and Kiev. So it was actually the Mongolians that split the ancestors of the Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian people through their conquest,
Mm.
because it was just the nation of the Rus was so utterly devastated from weakened civil
Yeah.
wars
Yeah.
before the Mongolians and the Mongolians
The Mongolians.
that
Yeah.
there was nothing left of a cohesive people after that point. And by the time the Mongolian Empire collapsed, the nature and the culture had all kind of changed a little bit, and they were broken up into pockets. So one family established themselves in the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Another
Hmm.
one reemerged in Kiev as well, but
Okay.
not to the same extent as it did in
Prestige
Moscow.
that it once had. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. And eventually, the last Mongolian dictator, I guess, and the guy who was
Caliph.
administering, yeah, was
Oh.
driven out by none other than first leader of the modern Russian state, Ivan the Terrible.
Mm.
So it's interesting that, and from Ivan's reign till about the start of Catherine's, or was it? Yeah, because I think Catherine's after Peter the Great, if I'm not mistaken. I should look that up. I can't remember which one's first, but it was the two of them, Catherine and Peter, that kind of took that romanticized idea from 100 years before, when they were retaking, or I guess reconquering, what they believed to be right their
The
historical
Rus. Yeah.
homeland. Yeah,
Yeah.
that they then got the idea of their own version of manifest destiny from the Mongolians in a
Okay.
very similar way, because I guess, yeah, you had the establishment of the Grand Duchy of Moscow that was in like in the 15th, sorry, 16th century, so the 1500s, and Peter the Great was two centuries later, and by that point, the nation of Russia stretched from Siberia to Eastern Europe. Yeah, I think it was Peter that pushed the Russian boundaries as furthest to their furthest extent they'd ever been. And it's just, I found that so interesting that it was under the Mongolians that the Duchy of Moscow became its own independent city state.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like their defeating of and driving out the final Mongolians that kind of created what we would consider the modern Russian state, and the split of what we consider now today as the Eastern Slavic people, which would be considered Ukrainians, Russians, and like Belarusians,
Okay.
because they
Yeah.
all speak a very like similar but slightly different language, I guess. Whereas during the Mongolian times, when the Mongolians showed up, it was a bunch of city states that all spoke roughly the same language with varying dialects. And they
Hmm.
changed that to the degree that it changed the way nations were shaped and reformed after, to the point that even to this day, we still live with those geopolitical boundaries. And that was
Yeah. Like a
one
once
example.
united. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, because history might have been very different if they didn't, because the nation of the Rus may have been formed in Kiev, and modern day Russia may still be based in Kiev if that never changed, because they may
Hmm.
have all not have been what's the word, like sundered as a people by the Mongolians, because that's what
Yeah.
happens when the Mongolians came in. They were separated by these, they wiped out all of the major cities minus Novgorod and some other one, but Novgorod I think is like somewhere in modern day Poland, would have been in somewhere in modern day Poland. So
Okay.
not actually modern day Novgorod. That's, they've moved that
Yeah. Yeah.
somewhere in Siberia. But yeah, there was only
Renamed.
two of the actual cities that really. So there wasn't enough of the culture left, and they became these isolated pockets in different parts of like these inhospitable landscape.
Okay. Yeah.
Because Ukraine and Russia are very similar, like very cold, harsh, bitter winters, giant
Hmm.
rivers that cut through them, like the Volga and the Don River and the Dnieper River and all that kind of stuff, right? So the Mongolians within 100 years had sundered these people to the point that by the time they left, they were forming separate nations,
Yeah, that
and
kind of
they
unity
were
structure that they once had
yeah,
is
it was
just,
gone, and they were
yeah.
now separately, not completely distinct, but enough to be language was distinct and culture had changed. It's just so very interesting to think that a nation like a conquering empire like that can create nations as we know them.
Yeah, because now modern day, you just think of those countries as
As their own,
individual
correct?
countries. Yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah,
it's like a weird way of thinking. Like, okay, maybe just like all Canadians and European Americans of European descent at one point were one group of people, and like the Great Winter happened, and the Canadians were sundered from the Americans, and like we just started pouring maple syrup on everything. That was like the Mongolian equivalent
that's
of
what you're trying to.
what
Yeah.
they did to the Eastern Slavic people. Yes, yeah. And it it wasn't just there, but another interesting place of note too is we know that Mongolia's biggest rival in history was China,
Hmm.
and it's very interesting that because China was a much and always is and has been a much bigger nation than Mongolia,
Yeah.
and that kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier about the Mongolians allowing local people who had influence to continue on the administration in their name. Is they learned that first in China because that was the first place they really had their successes. They stormed the Great
Yeah.
Wall, they got in, and they dissolved the Han Dynasty, I believe. But it's funny to think because in the same thing with Russia's case, the Mongolians, a lot of the ethnic groups we have in China today is thanks to the Mongolian conquest. Because you have in the West, like the what we today is the Xinjiang province,
Okay.
which is the far western, I guess, which historically speaking, up until that point, was never really part of China. But
Hmm.
after the Mongolians left and the Han Dynasty wanted to reconsolidate their strength after the trauma of being conquered by Mongols, thought the only way it will be safe is if we expand our borders and fortify. And that same thinking continued under the Qing Dynasty, who actually conquered the Han Dynasty about 2 centuries after the Mongolians left. And it's kind of ironic because the Qing people were not ethnically Han, they were Manchurian.
Hmm.
So they were a little bit more mixed with Mongoloid
Yeah.
ancestry. So it's interesting that it's almost like they kind of came back to haunt China again in a separate way centuries later, but they used the exact same style of rule and administration as well.
Yeah. Hmm.
And it did. And the Qings, when they conquered China, they broke these regions that the Hans had expanded all their borders to, and they
Okay.
kind of like isolated these regions. And you have a little bit more today where you have these regions that have a lot more like ethnic differences than they would have under like the Han until Mao came and changed all that again.
Okay.
But historically speaking, for centuries after the Mongolians until the start of the Communist Revolution, you had these large pockets of ethnic minorities in China
Hmm.
in their own provinces, and it was just life as usual for them. They went on practicing their normal religious stuff, but it wasn't until the Qing dynasty where they were kind of all brought under the one real umbrella, and they expanded China's borders to what it was its greatest extent. And
Okay.
just like Russia, I feel like it was like the trauma of being conquered so quickly and so effectively and so thoroughly that once you kind of regained your footing, we can see the same historical references actually in Spain and Portugal. The Moors
Okay.
conquered the Iberian Peninsula for almost 600 years,
Yeah.
and the indigenous inhabitants of what is today Spain and Portugal were subjugated to Islamic rule for 7 centuries almost. And
Hmm.
what we know is the Reconquista turned into what we already talked about during our Black Death episode was the Spanish conquest of the New World. And it's this idea of like once you've been like conquered as a people that you form this it seems like there's like this trauma that forms it. Now we must make sure this never happens again, and
Yeah,
we
you
must
you
be
turn you
stronger.
turn more
Yeah.
towards that offensive realist that we've talked about
Yes.
before.
And you get the starting building blocks of these big empires like the Spanish Empire and the Russian
Hmm.
Empire and the Qing dynasty in Russia, which was also very militaristic, unlike the Han dynasty before them. Whereas the Han dynasty was powerful because it was a big nation with lots of people and resources, but they weren't primarily a militaristically thinking people.
Hmm.
The Qings, the Qing dynasty and the Manchurians were like a horse step people, just like the Mongolians.
Yep,
So they had that very much attitude of no, we iron
this is
fist.
what we do. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah. So I always thought that was just it's one of those things. How one little like certain events in history start off so like oh the Mongolian conquest of the people of the Rus, and how that has created the nations we know today
Hmm.
in that part of the world, and they are distinct in themselves, right? Like Belarus and Russia. Like I remember there was like a Winter Olympics where like the competition between them and hockey, like it's like Toronto and Montreal, right? The rivalry. Like, nah, we're better
Yeah.
at hockey. It's like, nah, we're
Yeah.
better at hockey. It's like, yeah, you got that like innate rivalry that comes with it, the territory, right?
Yeah. No, it's true. Yeah, yeah. I know what you're saying with that.
Yeah. And it's just, yeah, there's these little things that even something as simple as the Silk Road that the Mongolians were like, yes, the Silk Road had existed in loose forms from like the Roman times, but the Mongolians were the catalyst that really started this network of global trade.
Well, I think, yeah, if you want to even go back to that, because I think that is a huge point.
Yeah.
The difference is that um, prior to the Mongolians, really, you don't have a like unified system of governance that covers the whole aspect of sorry, not aspect, the whole region of the Silk Road, right?
So yes,
So
correct.
like you said,
Yes. It
where
was always
under the
run
Mong
by fractured empires. You're right.
yeah,
Yeah.
so under the Mongolian Empire, right, how you had mentioned earlier, you basically can get, if you were a trader, you could go there, you can get like a little slip that says, "Hey, I'm
Yeah.
authorized to be here. Like
Mongolian
I
passport.
don't
Yeah.
have to pay kind of any like troll tax type of
Yeah.
type of
Yeah.
thing
No,
to
no
cross the
state
bridge."
tribute. Yeah.
Yeah, as opposed to prior to, every single state that you crossed was another kind of set of rules, another set of laws, another set of tributes, right? Like
Yeah.
go
Different
down the
ruler.
list.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and in some cases, especially, and this is kind of um, also somewhat telling for, not that we're going to get into this, but like why the Crusades happened in the first place was the religious and ethnic tensions that were happening in some of these places
Yes.
meant that you couldn't necessarily move through certain countries or certain states, right? Um,
The
Obviously,
Mongolians
the Silk Road is,
pacified. Yes.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
there's that historians use that term Pax Romana, where there was like 2 centuries of relative
hmm,
peace throughout most of Europe because the Romans were just so heavy handed.
yep,
There's also a term coined Pax Mongolia, where there was like 100 years of just everybody was doing so well trading because the Mongolians came in and shut everybody up and made them play by
yeah,
their rules and only their
yeah,
rules.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. So if
But
you
then
could fall in line, you're fine,
correct.
right?
Which
Yeah.
we can even attribute to starting the Renaissance in Europe because it was silks that Marco Polo brought back to Italy from China that the Mongolians opened that route. They
Hmm.
made it safe from
Yeah,
someone to go from Italy to China because it was all controlled by one the
yeah. One
same
ruler.
administrative group of people. Yeah.
Yeah, because it does, and that obviously the as I not exact can't remember if we've necessarily talked about it here, but the Silk Road in its own self could be an episode, but that
Oh yeah.
has has been not only a tool for trade, right? Like getting different resources, spices, all that kind of stuff, right? Silks that you mentioned. Um,
Correct. Yeah. The
but
luxury goods,
I
but
apologize if you've already mentioned it in this episode, but I know like both you and I, but you even talked about it to me today, I thought, that the Silk Road also allowed for a lot of information, right?
correct.
Um,
Yes.
And
Yeah, we did
that,
briefly, but there is, you're right, like the idea that the printing press, gunpowder is another one.
yeah. And I think the coming out of the dark ages, so to speak, right? Bringing on the Renaissance era comes from that. Enlightenment doesn't just simply spark from nothing.
Nothing.
It does spark from kind of this lost information coming back to Europe, um, through the travels along the Silk Road, right? Like, because
Correct. Yeah.
it's not it's funny enough that I think a lot of the things that come out of the Enlightenment era, like the Renaissance and stuff like that, are not necessarily new information. Obviously, there is breakthroughs that happen in science and stuff like that,
Regardless. Yeah.
but the kind of building blocks that return were things that used to be within Europe, within the Roman Empire, within, right, like
Empire.
all of those
Yeah.
countries that kind of make up that. Um, and it's not until, like you said, this traveling through the Silk Road for resources that you also gained a lot of information, um, and realizing that there's
Yeah.
a whole nother world, so to speak,
World of
there.
technology, and like we are talking about the paper making,
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
that was one for sure. But even like we were saying, silk is another big one, because that really did start once that hit the city states of Italy. It's almost hilarious that like the Mongolians' enlightenment started the Renaissance that started the Enlightenment in Europe, and like in
Yeah.
an indirect way, right? And you're like, it's just,
Yeah.
it's crazy how it's like why we call it the catalyst. Like all these little
Yeah.
things are interconnected, right? Like, yeah, if you don't have the Silk Road controlled by one entity, because you got to think
Yeah.
that's 5,000 miles through some of the roughest terrain on the planet. It's
Yeah.
mountains and desert and just vast areas of frozen tundra. That's like, and this is before like electric heating and stuff. Like you had to be prepared. So the
Yeah.
Mongolians made it not just possible, they made it able to thrive in terms of
Hmm.
trade. And it continued after they were gone because the benefits were so good to all those nations that why stop it?
And I was just gonna say, like, not because obviously this is another whole conversation in its own right, but um, like you had mentioned, the Silk Road had existed. It's existed, I think, in theory since like the time of Alexander the Great, right?
Yes, yeah.
Um, because really the Silk Road is just a trade route from east to west type of
It's an area
situation.
people have traversed, yeah,
Yeah.
traditionally. Yeah.
But under the Mongols, like we've already said, this idea that kind of um, stability that comes from the
Yeah.
oppression or whatever, the conquering of all these places, um, the stability that does come out of that, allowed for a lot more people to travel through there, which also made for some of the countries that line the Silk Road to really flourish. And like you said,
Yes.
these are countries that
Start to become
may not
empires of
have
their own.
existed. Yeah,
Yeah.
like because they started to kind of fill that purpose, like you had just mentioned. Some of this terrain is not necessarily the most hospitable
Yeah, it's
to
tough. You like the
travel,
central,
right?
like Uzbekistan
So
and those kind of places. Yeah.
yeah, so you need to have towns and things like that that service that
All the
travel need.
trade and
Yeah,
traveling. Yes,
yeah. Um,
exactly.
so yeah, it's interesting to even look at some of those countries that really probably wouldn't have been a country had it not been for this need for travel or this
And
desire for travel
yeah,
through the
the
Silk Road.
conquest of the Mongolians and their hunger for trade
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
finding new stuff, because that was really just as much as they were into conquering, they were into finding new stuff.
Yeah.
That was a big, yeah.
Yeah.
They were usually just willing to as much willing to barter as they were to fight you. So it's,
Yeah. It was like, we'll trade. And if you don't
yeah,
want to trade on our terms, then
too
we'll
bad.
just come.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
Yeah,
stampede of horses will come your way.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
but it's yeah, it's I those. It's interesting. It's just I feel like it's just interesting to look at that and realize that a conquering empire was not only just able to influence what we would consider enlightened ways of, maybe not the institutions themselves, but the way we apply the institutions now, and how
Mm-hmm.
we, and how, like,
Yeah.
in the modern sense, in a fair and just nation, everybody and anybody has the chance to prove their worth if they're willing to put in the work, or and they have the talent.
Yeah. And I think even because obviously you can point out it wasn't that simply um, different than some of the other catalysts that we've talked about. It wasn't that the Mongols do this and then it's just like a shift in enlightenment and then that's the kind of common
The
narrative going
world's a
forward,
better
right?
place all of a sudden. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, yeah.
Like so
There's a lot
you
of
had
trial and,
mentioned whatever, the French Empire when they invaded, it's not
or
like
even
they
the
just
Mughal Empire
allowed
that,
everyone.
yeah, it took over India from Persia. I think it was just after the Mongols retreated out of there in the 16th century. And
Yeah. But what I was going to say is that I think the value of looking at the Mongol Empire, I mean, there's lots of things, but in particular for the standpoint of you'd kind of talked about this inclusivity. I don't want to go as far as saying like human rights, but but like
yeah,
the inclusivity aspect of
yeah,
it,
yeah, they
of
were known.
allowing, yeah, religious tolerance,
Correct.
cultural
Yeah.
tolerance, not being afraid of all those things.
And when
I
you
think it's
show up, you don't eradicate a people or who they are, you incorporate it, kind of thing.
yeah, I think it's like all of those things. I think you can look at the Mongols as a an example of why those values should be valued, right?
Valued.
Like the idea of not being threatened by cultures, the idea of um, allowing, like when you are becoming a more globalized world, right? Because that's what an
Yes,
empire
that's
is.
that's what they started doing. Yeah.
Yeah, you're really trying to have that sense of unity, and you have more success in your unity when you're kind of truly uniting rather than
Working with
oppressing
people,
a
then
certain culture or
yes, yeah,
saying that like
or
full
converting
out
them.
assimilation versus
Yes,
like an
yeah,
amalgamation of like multiple cultures, right?
yes,
um like
yeah,
the
because you
Mongols
can.
didn't lose their culture, they
They're
just
still
took on
around. Yeah,
other things with
correct.
it,
Yeah,
right?
yes, because, and we
um
brought it up earlier. At the same time, the Crusades were going on in the Middle East,
yeah,
and that
so
was, those were
intolerance all
wars of
around. Yeah,
assimilation. Correct. Yeah,
yeah,
it was either you became a Muslim or you became a Christian, and there was not much in between.
yeah, yeah,
But the Mongolians put an end to that because they beat the crap out of both of them
yeah. It's like
equally,
you both don't matter. So stop it.
and
Yeah,
then became
like
so much more powerful than than their respective kingdoms combined, that it left pause
yeah.
for when the Mongolian Empire collapsed, and how the new leaders coming into these roles would kind of take on some of those positions. And it, like you said, it doesn't happen right away. You have plenty of empires that rise and fall over the next 7 centuries that do very immoral things.
Well, and I think
But it's
it's
the
the mix of
direction.
it, right?
Yeah.
Like so you had already talked about like for the Russians, like the Rus, like, and arguably I would say unfortunately the lessons from the Mongolian Empire were that
Conquest. Yeah.
yeah, it unless we become the conquerors, we potentially can be conquered, right? Like so
Correct.
they
Yeah.
looked at it, most people looked at it as like, okay, I'm going to have that offensive realist standpoint as opposed to the other lesson that maybe is coming out a little bit more in a modern times, right? Like
Yeah.
post-colonial era in that sense, that it it doesn't really work out as well as it should if you are that oppressive figure. If you are
Correct.
that like let me just invade rather than let us unite,
You
right?
won't achieve your goal of
Yeah.
statehood and of what you're trying to get done, right?
Yeah, cuz I think that there are pockets and examples of groups that come after the Mongols that are a lot more religiously tolerant,
Correct.
not intolerant, tolerant, right, and
Yeah.
culturally tolerant. But there are obviously, unfortunately, I think a large chunk of them because the Mongols were also so ruthless at times,
Correct.
because
The
they were very
scarring of that.
heavy-handed.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, you the Mongols weren't there to teach people a lesson in terms of like philosophy, right? So
Correct.
they were
Yes.
trying
Yeah.
to run their empire the way
And if
that
they were, they weren't doing it intentionally or directly.
yeah. So they weren't trying to be like, oh, we're doing religious. Like we already said this, we're not. They didn't do they didn't tolerate cultures and religions because uh, whatever God told them, or like from a philosophical standpoint, from like
Yeah, no, they did
morality,
because
right? They
it
did it
was
because
the
it was practical.
yes, the best way for
Yeah.
everybody to get along. Yeah.
Yeah. So um I think
Which at the end of the
cultures and
day,
countries took what they wanted from the lesson side of things,
from
and
the
unfortunately,
Mongolians,
some of
correct.
them, right, or a lot of them, took the kind of more military
Yeah,
oriented
the
lessons. But
hard-lined aspect from it, yeah.
yeah, but I think to your kind of original point was that some of the lessons of tolerance that we now see kind of
Is
incorporated into
so
our lives.
ubiquitous. Yeah, it's just, oh, that's
Yeah,
just the way you treat people. Yeah.
yeah. If it's not even just like a hey, it's because of the Mongols, it's at least you can point out the fact that like the Mongols are an example of where this went well, like how
Yes.
this was a positive
Yes.
thing,
And
right?
arguably the first time in history where it was a success.
Yeah, yeah,
Even for a short
exactly.
time, it was.
Yeah, because that's not what the fall of the Mongol Empire does not come from that.
No, no,
If anything, you could make the argument
it's
that's why it lasts as long as it
as
does,
long as it did.
right?
Actually, we were bringing up
Yeah,
that point earlier that you had caliphates in the Black Sea region under Mongol rule, like well
yeah,
into the 17th century, long
yeah.
after the Mongolian Empire itself had dissolved.
Yeah. Because I think, like any empire, really, I mean, obviously, there's the politics of everything, right? Like, so if
Yes,
you
yeah,
don't have political stability, that will crumble an empire. But a lot of empires fail because of succession,
yes,
right?
and that was
Um,
Mongolia's issue as well.
yeah.
There was so many. Well, and we did mention how many descendants Genghis Khan busied himself creating. So within a few
Yeah.
generations, it made there was
Yeah. A
too
lot of
many people
people
wanting
vying for
a piece.
power.
Yeah,
And then inevitably, someone comes into power that is way too young to be in power. And then they just
yeah.
get manipulated. And then the, like, kind of, yeah,
From there, it's
bureaucratic
yeah,
political chaos unravels everything, and then
everything.
someone
Yeah,
kind of jumps in and says, hey, I'm going to take my turn now, goodbye. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think just to wrap everything up there,
Yeah, go
I
for it.
think it's just to go back to like you were saying the original 2 points. It's just important to kind of remember, like especially for me as I was looking some of this stuff up, that it's like wow, it's like little things happened a long time ago. Sometimes take a while to play out the way maybe we intend them to be now,
Hmm.
but we don't always look for where this origin of this stuff was, because you would think most people think that like, oh no, equality and institution started with like Martin Luther King in the 60s. You're like, in a modern sense, partially yes, but there was other people doing it centuries ago.
Yeah, it's not a new
And the idea
concept.
survived through
Yeah.
time, right? And it's like that whole idea of the human game of telephone.
Yeah, the reemergence from yeah.
Yes, because the Mongolians, their entire time there, like we were saying, it's like they brought back the Renaissance of the Silk Road. Like the Silk Road had existed since the Roman and Parthian times, but it wasn't until the Mongolians who actually brought it all together, and like we were saying, made it one continuous trade route for everyone along it,
Yeah.
instead of it being kind of just a way to get to another part of the world and having cool stuff to find along the way if you can survive.
Hmm.
Kind of
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, because you
Yeah.
might come into this region as a Christian and get killed, or you might come into this region as a
and,
pagan and get
and
killed. And
be
so,
yeah.
yeah. But are the Mongolians, that all changed. And it's
Hmm.
something so simple like that they were doing that 800 years ago.
Yeah, in a time where
It was
arguably
arguably
speaking,
the
like
end of the
even
Dark
because
Ages. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and not only that, I mean, we've talked about religion a lot, but even in general, like even within religion, most states, like nations, were not necessarily working together, right?
Correct.
Like,
Yeah.
uh, sure,
Everyone
the
was very much
Crusades
at odds.
allowed for
Yeah.
people to unite behind a cause, but Europe at the time was fighting itself, and like so like the Pope pretty much has to be like, all right, stop fighting each other. We're
Yes.
going to focus
Yeah.
on this, right?
That's yeah.
The same thing for the Islamic world, right? There's lots of different groups. Like it's not like so in general, even where there are common lines, there's still intolerance. There's still like
Tolerance. Correct. Yeah.
yeah, like the clashes that exist. Um and it's not lost I think on either one of us that yeah, the only way that the kind of unity happens is when one party just conquers the world.
The
So
world.
sure,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
that's not exactly the
It's
message
not the
of
ideal situation. No.
yeah,
Yeah.
but the end result um you can see where there's some positives or like
Positives. Yeah.
the the
Yeah, and well, and that's I think the
progress
thing to
point.
take away from this, especially, is even
Mhm.
the darkest parts of history. A lot of good stuff comes out of it,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think
100%.
and in today's day and age, we like to go back and they were so wrong for doing that. Well, we didn't live in those times, so we shouldn't judge what they did wrong, but we should take away the things they did right and learn from
Yeah.
those
And they
things.
wouldn't be alone.
Correct.
Like
No.
that
Correct.
mentality,
Yeah.
that ruthlessness, the
That's
pillaging,
ubiquitous to
the
human nature.
yeah, right? Like that is uh a very barbaric lifestyle and time, right? Like you
Yeah.
could say like they're the Mongols were originally uncivilized, right? Like
Yes, and you
because
have
they
that
were
idea of they were
nomadic people, but
these barbarians, but
like
really,
who wasn't?
yeah,
Right?
they
Like
did more to
these
modernize the Western
yeah,
world than the Western world
then
did at the time
yeah,
in
yeah,
terms of the way we know it today.
yeah.
In
I'd say
terms of
that
acceptance and administration and all that stuff. It's yeah, that's I feel like if anything, that's really what's cool to take away from this is
mhm.
even yeah, because it's we can have a whole episode on the British Empire and all the bad things it did. We can also have an entire same amount of time I can spend you on how the infrastructure they built still being used in a lot of developing countries today.
Mhm. Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, there's
yeah,
always
silver
both
lining to the
sides.
evil, like the
Yes.
bad side of our nature sometimes, and I feel like it's just try to. Sometimes we like to tend to focus on all of the negatives when
Mhm.
we look at history, and I feel like we should also not forget to focus on the good things too.
Definitely. Well, I think that that's a great place for us to leave it.
Sir, yeah, it's I don't know about you, but I'm getting ready for lunch.
Sounds
I just
good.
saw the time. I was like, "Oh my god, I ate
Yeah.
like 4 hours ago already." It's like,
Oh
okay, no,
my goodness.
you can make noises. That's fine.
Yeah.
It's time, and
Too
you got
funny.
it.
Well, as always, I'm Braden. He's Jordan, and this was the Catalyst.